On November 21, 1960, a large team of scientists, technicians, and engineers anxiously awaited the launch of the Redstone rocket from the Air Force Station at Cape Canaveral, Florida, until something unusual and unthinkable happened. The rocket launched, but the engine shut down soon after. The rocket had risen only 10 centimeters and fell back onto the launch pad. The escape tower was ejected, and then the main parachute deployed, followed by the reserve. So there stood a rocket completely filled with highly explosive fuels that the wind could topple at any moment, causing a huge explosion. And no one had any control over the rocket, since all the cables had disconnected as soon as the rocket took off. Some people suggested sending someone to reconnect the cables manually, but it would be too dangerous. Some suggested sending someone to cut the parachutes to prevent the wind from making the rocket fall, but it would be too dangerous. Some people suggested firing at the fuel tanks, which was dangerous and could cause a huge explosion. The event could have been exactly like the Vanguard TV-3, which happened 3 years earlier. On that day, right after liftoff, with only 2 seconds of flight and at a height of 1.2 meters, the rocket lost power and fell back onto the launch pad, creating a huge explosion that destroyed the rocket, the satellite on board, and the launch pad itself. But for us to understand how this whole problem with the Redstone was solved, we need to go back 64 years in the past. At the end of the 1950s, the space race influenced by the Cold War was in full swing. Two superpowers were competing to show who could achieve the most impressive feats, while also demonstrating power and superiority through science, both military and space-related. On one side, the Soviet Union was achieving impressive feats, such as putting the first satellite into space, sending the first man to orbit planet Earth, among others. On the other side, the United States was also achieving incredible feats, but always 2 or 3 steps behind. And it was in this context that, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the United States was conducting various studies and tests with rockets. Things like flight computers, automatic in-flight approach systems, fuels, separation between the rocket and the capsule, among many others, were being thoroughly tested and improved. On November 21, 1960, under the mission called Mercury Redstone 1, which would be the first mission of Project Mercury, the first manned spaceflight program of the United States, in which the mission would consist of performing a suborbital flight with no people on board, aiming to test the safety, reliability, and compliance of the various onboard systems of the Mercury capsule, manufactured by McDonnell Douglas, as well as the Mercury Redstone rocket. The Mercury Redstone rocket was 25 meters tall, 1.78 meters in diameter, and weighed 30 tons. In addition, it used a mixture of alcohol and liquid oxygen as fuel. The rocket was previously a ballistic missile used to carry nuclear bombs, but it underwent several changes to adapt to the characteristics and conditions of the Mercury program. This would be a suborbital flight, meaning that the rocket would not enter orbit around the Earth, but instead would follow a ballistic trajectory and re-enter the atmosphere. On that morning of November 21, 1960, around 9 o'clock, a huge team made up of scientists, engineers, technicians, among others, were anxiously waiting for the rocket's launch. Then the unthinkable happened. The rocket ignited its engine and took off, but soon after, the engine shut down prematurely. The rocket had only risen 3.8 inches, or 9.6 centimeters, and fell back onto the launch pad. The escape tower was jettisoned and rose about 1,200 meters as planned. 3 seconds later, the main parachute was deployed, followed by the reserve. So there it was, standing upright, a rocket completely filled with highly flammable fuels, attached to nothing. And the wind threatened to make it fall at any moment, creating a huge explosion. And to make matters worse, the only cables that allowed any control over the rocket had disconnected at the moment of liftoff. Some people in the control room started suggesting sending someone to reconnect the cables, but as mentioned before, that would be very dangerous. That's because, besides the rocket being completely full of fuel, with 2 parachutes deployed and attached to nothing, the retro rocket system used to guide the capsule in flight, as well as a package of explosive charges, from the rocket's self-destruct system were armed. The mission flight director, Chris Kraft, also rejected several other ideas proposed by the panicked team in the room, including sending someone to cut the parachutes and firing a rifle at the fuel tanks. But what caused all this trouble, and how was this problem solved? The sequence of steps for the Mercury Redstone 1 mission for the launch of the Redstone rocket was as follows. After liftoff, the rocket would fly until it reached a speed of Mach 6, that is, 6 times the speed of sound. About 2 minutes and 20 seconds after liftoff, the escape tower would be jettisoned. On a mission with astronauts on board, this tower would be used to pull the capsule containing the astronauts far away in case of a serious rocket failure. The next step would be the separation of the capsule from the rest of the rocket by small solid fuel motors. The capsule would then change its orientation, and retro rockets would be fired, slightly reducing the capsule's horizontal speed. After a few minutes of free fall, the parachutes would be deployed, and moments later, the capsule would splash down in the ocean. Despite all the potential risks, everyone agreed that only the next day it would be safe to approach the rocket, since the wind conditions were favorable and there was no indication they would get worse. And director Chris Kraft listened to the advice of one of the engineers who said it was better to wait until the next day, as the batteries would discharge and the fuel would heat up and evaporate on its own. The cause of this incident, according to the investigation, was 2 cables that connected to the rocket and separated in the wrong order. At the base of the rocket, on one of the fins, 2 cables were connected. One of them was a 4-pin power cable that supplied power to the rocket until the last second and kept the batteries charged. And the other was a 60-pin control cable. The 4-pin power cable had to disconnect last because besides supplying power, it also provided grounding for the rocket systems. But that day, the 60-pin control cable was longer than expected. That's because it was actually a cable for another missile, not for the Redstone. So an adjustment was made to the cable to compensate. This caused the control cable to disconnect last instead of being the first, with the separation happening 29 milliseconds after the power cable had disconnected. In the brief milliseconds after the power cable had already disconnected before the control cable, the lack of grounding allowed a substantial current to pass through the relay that would shut down the engine, turning it off right after liftoff, something that should only happen much later with the rocket in flight. Since the engine had been shut down, the next stages of the launch sequence were triggered, such as the ejection of the escape tower and the deployment of the main parachute. As soon as the main parachute was deployed and the load sensors didn't detect any load on the parachute, the system concluded that the main parachute had failed, which caused the reserve to be deployed as well. The Redstone rocket suffered only minor damage to its fins when it fell, but with minor repairs it can be used again. A month later, another Redstone rocket, along with the same Mercury capsule, was used in another attempt. This time everything went well. The rocket